About
We're
the
all here.
delay.
Oh, no worries. Great. Well, welcome, Olivia McKenna, and welcome to everyone who is joining this chat, this Instagram Live. Really thank you for being here, and hello to everyone who's joining afterwards and watching us. So I want to introduce first Olivia Ferraro, who is based in New York City, and she's a Gen Z advisor at the Climate Mental Health Network. She's also founder of Climate Cafe NYC, and McKenna Parnes is based in Seattle, a professor at University of Washington, and one of the authors on this new study in the Lancet that we're here to talk about. And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Sarah Newman, the director of the Climate Mental Health Network. And I also just wanted to say to everyone who is joining live, please feel free to write comments and questions in the chat. It's obviously very informal here on Instagram Live. So yeah, so McKenna, maybe you could get us started and just sharing about the study, the key findings, and all of that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So this was a study, the data was collected in late 2023. And I actually jumped into the project a little bit later, but my co-authors, they built off of the original Hickman paper. So that was a 2021 paper that was looking at global responses of youth to climate change and climate emotions. And we were curious to really see these findings in the context of the United States more specifically. So I think one of the best parts about this work is that young people were actually included in thinking through the survey items. And so there was a focus group that was done, which tested some of the items with the young people before it was sent out as a larger survey. And so what we're seeing is there's really widespread distress across the United States among youth in response to climate change, which I don't think any of us are surprised by. We've been hearing that more and more. But I think these findings are really striking because we're seeing it also within each individual state. Young people, I'd say more than 60% across each state are moderately, very, or extremely worried about climate change. They're saying it's impacting their thoughts and their emotions, their ideas for the future, and they're also really calling on a response from older generations, governments, I think other people, myself included as a clinician and educator, to respond and to take action because they're definitely concerned about what's going to happen in the future.
Thanks. Olivia, I'd love to just hear your thoughts about the study and your initial response upon hearing about it, the findings.
I want to echo a lot of what McKenna mentioned. Just a lot of this is stuff that I think, as someone who's both a young person and engages with climate mental health as part of my everyday life, like the study's findings were unsurprising and also yet validating too. And in a lot of ways, it was very interesting to me to notice specifically how respondents rated different types of feelings that in a lot of contexts might seem equivalent, but I think young people today are like reckoning with a set of emotions that maybe we aren't culturally like well equipped to handle, and that are in a lot of cases really new. Like older generations, I think, have had a hard time understanding the like deep existential feelings that come up about climate when it comes to young people. So for me, I was really both excited and a little bit disheartened to see how distressed people are. I think one of the biggest things that popped up to me, and I would love to talk more about this today, is kind of some of the delta between folks who do talk about climate and who reported feeling kind of like ignored or silenced, and then those who said that they don't talk about climate and responded that they wish other people talked more about it. So like thinking about those two types of responses, like where does that put us in bringing climate into everyday conversations?
And if I could just respond to some of what you're saying, Olivia, I also thought the emotions were so notable. And I think so often the discussion around climate change and mental health is rooted in anxiety, but I think there's just so much more that's there, this existential dread, these feelings of sadness, this deep concern and exposure to events like this that I think when older generations were younger, they didn't have access to information every single day, 24/7, unregulated. And so how are we really thinking about this exposure and awareness and all of the different emotions that it's bringing up?
Yeah.
Um, and to speak to your question around talking about climate change, it was so notable that the people, yeah, that are doing so, I think I was curious more qualitatively, like who are people trying to talk to? Who are they feeling ignored and dismissed by? And how do we need to be responding to that? But this desire for it to be part of conversations more and more, I think I exist in my echo chambers where I'm thinking about and talking about climate change all the time, and that's just not the case for so many people.
Yeah. One thing that I thought was really curious is like whenever I host climate cafes or host trainings for people to learn how to host climate cafes, one of the biggest like feelings I encounter is people who believe that like nobody else cares about the problem as much as they do. I think there's some like outdated information that like 80 to 90% of adults in the US think that their peers don't care as much about climate as they do. And it's so interesting to me to see that like appear in this data around like I wish I'm not talking about it, but I wish other people would talk about it. And like the majority of people feeling that way, it's like, well, if we started talking about it, we would soon realize that like this is something that everyone's really worried about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the questions that I had for kind of your takeaways from the study, and something that I was also thinking about a lot when I was reading this, is that there are some instances where political affiliation impacts respondents' feelings about various climate emotions. And I was really surprised and heartened to see that in a lot of cases, even for participants who might have had like a political affiliation not predisposed to caring very much about climate, that like it was still a very important thing for them. I would love to hear more about your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is that this issue of climate change among younger generations is more and more depoliticized, right? It's like we're all caring about it. It's not something that should be a partisan issue. It's something that everyone should be responding to. And so I was really motivated by that as well. And the thoughts around how we should respond may look different. I think that's something to explore more. But I think most meaningfully, this is something we need to be thinking about across the political spectrum to respond to the needs of young people. And I feel hopeful and yeah, inspired by it because I think that as young people are going into positions of power and are going to be, leaders in now and in the future, my thought is that climate change will be responded to more effectively. But I think it really calls on all of us right now to take this seriously, given that such a pressing issue.
Yeah, and something that I thought was really illustrative that you guys included in the presentation of the data, and anyone who's listening who hasn't had a chance to check out the actual data itself, I really encourage you to. It's set up in a like interactive map and graph format, but I really liked how you overlaid instances of natural disasters from like fires and floods and everything with the respondents' data. I thought that that made a lot.
And just to hop in, the map that Olivia is referencing, the URL is us-climate-emotions-map.org. And it also, just to echo what you're saying, Olivia, about the responses across political affiliation, I found it really both kind of surprising, but also really inspiring. And, just thinking about how do we start, it kind of goes back to your question of people not feeling heard and then people not, people feeling isolated. And, how do we start to have those conversations? We need to have those conversations across the political divide, no matter what people's affiliation are, and how that could be part of the process of people not feeling so isolated. And, what could those conversations look like?
Yeah, definitely. And McKenna, a question for you and the team of researchers that you've worked with. How are you planning on using this data, or rather, like, what do you think this data means as far as like responses and action for climate mental health?
Yeah. I mean, my hope is that this data is shedding light on the different emotions that are coming up related to climate change and that people are going to take the climate change and mental health intersection more seriously. I think in a lot of conversations that I've had, even at my home institution, but with colleagues elsewhere, there's not a lot of understanding about climate change and mental health, as much as I think the climate change and physical health implications are understood. And so my hope is that people will be more invested in funding research that explores this, in developing interventions and really responding to young people in mental health sectors, and in thinking about effective communication strategies that are resilience building and not contributing to worse mental health outcomes, but that are actually encouraging people, especially young people, to feel motivated and supported in thinking about acting and responding to climate change.
What the respondents, what some of the top response were in terms of what people want or need, what they're looking for?
A lot of people are looking for the governments to take action. I think that was one of the top things that was highlighted. US governments, world governments, especially those from wealthier countries. And I think that's extremely notable, right? We can see very clearly that young people are saying this matters to them, and also that they will probably use their voices in meaningful ways to try and push more action. And I think it's also important to highlight in thinking through what young people want. Calling on everyone, all of us need to be responding and taking action. And so I think it's very clear, and we can always talk to government actors in thinking through the power that they have. And I think that for pediatric providers, how are you bringing up these discussions in the medical room? For educators, how are you talking about climate change in classroom settings and socio-emotionally informed ways? So I think that everyone can kind of see that young people want action and see young people want government action, but then also think about our own role and responsibility in taking action.
And what about, could you just talk a little bit about the findings in terms of what young people were saying that they want in their families, what they're looking for?
I think young people are wanting their families to have conversations about climate change. I think that was one thing that came up, and also thinking about their parents' responsibility and grandparents' responsibility in the role of climate change. And so that's also quite meaningful, because if you think about where young people are first having these conversations or learning about climate change, some are doing so in the family system and some are not. And also thinking about caregivers and the role that they have in supporting young people around this issue. And so I think it's also a huge responsibility in the context of the family system to think about the actions that they can be taking to model sustainable behavior, and thinking about all of the ways in which we need to be approaching sustainability, but also just the emotional support that needs to be given for young people that are feeling more and more distress around climate change, and making sure that they have a safe space to go home to express these emotions and actually get help if they're saying that they're feeling distressed.
Olivia, did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess one of the questions that I had while I was looking at this data is that obviously you have a couple of different types of emotive responses that participants could select to identify with. And how do you think variations in the terminology that folks are using to describe their climate emotions regionally make sense with a lot of the other data that you guys were thinking about going into the study?
That's such a good question. So just to clarify, some different regions of the country may be more or less open to different types of emotions and categorizing them in that ways. Yeah. That's such a thoughtful question. I think that in my mental health work, I've thought a lot about stigma, and specifically certain types of words or emotions that might be more stigmatized than others. And so thinking about these anxiety and depression versus sadness and powerlessness. And so I haven't thought too deeply about how this kind of came up in the context of our survey, but I think that there's a lot of intention around the words that are being used. And one thing that I'll say that I think is notable is we talk a lot about climate emotions and not wanting to pathologize them. And so not wanting to say that just because a young person is experiencing anxiety about climate change, that is something that is clinically significant in terms of being a generalized anxiety problem. And so some of my hope is that the emotions will make people more comfortable to the emotion words and being able to express them without worrying that now I'm going to be grouped into some category of having a mental health issue that I don't necessarily know if I identify with or feel comfortable with. And then my other hope is that for young people that are experiencing levels of distress that could rise to a level of clinical significance, these emotions also help them conceptualize like what is coming up for me, how deeply am I feeling it, and kind of what do I need to be doing. But I think looking at them, yeah, kind of exploring experience is around what those emotions mean by region could be really meaningful future
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. I was thinking specifically, like, I noticed that respondents were overall like hesitant to select grief, it seemed.
Mm-hmm.
And like that's an emotion that I feel has a lot of connotations that we like don't really collectively know how to handle. And I know it was interesting to see the difference in response rates for things like depression, sad, and grief, which in a lot of ways like might be somewhat synonymous. I thought that was curious, and there was like a hot spot around the Northeast where folks were more willing to select grief as an answer.
It's such a good point. And I was thinking about that data too. Part of me was wondering, is there this influence of how climate change and mental health has been historically framed, like with this anxiety emphasis, or talking about climate anxiety, so it's an easier thing to
Yeah.
access. But part of me, one of my colleagues, Dr. Jennifer Atkinson, teaches a course on eco anxiety and eco grief, and I think oftentimes it's hard for people to even understand when they're experiencing grief because our conceptualization of grief is so specific. But you can really experience grief in the context of climate change and the planet and the planet's health. And so maybe highlighting that for young people more and more and validating that emotion and experience will be an important path forward. Because oftentimes when you actually start talking with young people about it, that is something that's being shared, even if grief is not the label that's being used.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. Oh, go ahead,
Go
Sarah.
for it. Yeah.
Another result that I was curious to hear kind of your reflections on. One of the questions that you asked respondents was about the likeliness that they might elect not to have children because of the climate crisis. Um, and, you know, the results maybe are not as predictable as some of the other questions that you answered. So I was curious to hear any reflections on that or thoughts about how that played into the larger survey.
Yeah, and saying not as predictable, like it was a bit lower than you would
Yeah,
have maybe
it was
expected.
on a national basis. I think it was split 50-50, like folks who might choose not to have children because of this versus not a factor.
Yeah, I was reflecting on that quite a bit because I think anecdotally, when there was the Gen Z Climate Stories documentary that was shared, and that was one of the 17-year-olds I think in it spoke about that exact thing and how more and more young people are thinking about not having children. I I think that's probably something that, well, there are a few thoughts that I had. I was like, maybe people are not thinking about it as much, or they're like not as sure about what they're going to do. Like there are all of these world events that are happening or the ways that they're thinking about their life and their future. So potentially that's not playing a role. And I was also considering for people that are more involved in the climate movement. So if we just had a sample of youth climate activists or just had a sample of people that were really engaged with climate change, would that number have looked quite different? So I think it was quite notable to me that actually there was a 50%, because I was like, some of these people that were involved in this survey, this might not be something that they're primarily focusing on or thinking about, and asking this question about having children, it might be the first time that they're really thinking about it, even though my brain can always conceptualize that, like that's a reality for so many people. So I do wonder how that's going to shift more and more.
Yeah, that's such a great way of reframing the question and the results. And actually, another question I had too was I noticed that the demographic information, like as far as like race and class and some other like characteristics that might have informed some of the responses, like weren't included as a part of the results Did you have any like observations or thoughts on how those factors might have impacted the folks who responded?
I do. I mean, I think what the intention was with sampling was to try and get a sample that was representative of the US population. And so inherently, that's going to be a sample that's not as representative of certain voices. And so that was something where I think this data could be certainly looked at in the future with that in mind of how is this varying when you're considering these factors related to race, to class, to education, because I think that will yield extremely meaningful results. And I think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done, especially thinking about the young people who are on the frontline communities holding these intersecting identities that are going to be and are currently more impacted. So I guess I would say this paper did not focus on that, but I think there's a lot of room for future studies from this data to explore those questions.
That makes a lot of sense.
So just explain for people who are who might not have looked at the survey yet or who are just watching now, but just explaining about the findings in terms of this is state by state, but it's not representative of the entire population and what that.
Yeah. So this essentially what we set out to do was collect a sample of youth across the United States. But part of that was what we did was use something called convenience sampling. So we were accessing people that would express interest. It wasn't a totally random sample, so you can't say that this is perfectly representative. But then you can um, try to intentionally sample based on certain characteristics, or you can use statistical analysis that kind of ends up balancing things out so that it can be more representative. So this isn't a perfect representation of the population by any means. There are limitations related to sampling. I think that's discussed in the study, but it's moving as close as possible as we could given what we had.
And it's still obviously hugely impactful knowing that the sample is nearly 16,000 youth and what the findings are. So, well, we're coming up on almost half an hour here. Olivia, do you have any?
Sarah, you just broke up there for a second. I don't know if it was just my video.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying we're coming up almost an hour, and I was just asking if you had any closing, final question or thoughts.
Yeah, one of the thoughts that I wanted to call out is that, so I actually shared the survey results with some folks in my life, and especially I noticed like responses from older people to the survey results um, identified that like they were surprised that there was in a lot of cases like higher levels of concern in states that might typically vote Republican or that are known for being like conservative strongholds. So like some of the biggest example being like Texas and Florida. Um, and it was just really interesting to me to see that like Texas had basically the same, in aggregate, had the same um, like level of worry as a state like Washington in the Pacific Northwest. And I thought it was really important to call out to participants or to folks who might not be thinking about this, but like there are so many young people in all of these states that have never voted in an election before, who might be participating more in the political process coming this year and thereafter. So it's really exciting to me just to see like how young people's views and thoughts might change policy outcomes over the next 5 to 10 years.
I feel exactly the same way, Olivia. I'm really hopeful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mackenzie, would you like to give us with some final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say I'm really grateful to have been involved in this study. I think it's really meaningful findings, and I think what we need to be doing more and more is creating these intergenerational partnerships to tackle this issue and to really be thinking about what are youth wanting, how are we responding to it, and what are young people already doing? I mean, incredible things in the context of the climate movement, and how can we be supporting those efforts? There's some research on, I think, responding to climate change and climate action as being beneficial to mental health. But I also think that there's a lot of research that talks about burnout and overwhelm and young people involved in social movements in particular being anxious. And so how are we thinking through creating sustainable ways of responding to climate change and supporting young people in these efforts. It's something I really near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, agree. This is something that I think about in our work at Climate Mental Health Network all the time, and I am, but I really just value being able to do this intergenerational work. And I also just wanted to, for people who are tuning in now, just to let you know that we are doing a whole series of conversations about this study. So this is the first one today. They're going to all be at noon Eastern time through the next week. So on Tuesday, we're going to have a conversation here on Instagram Live that's going to be with people working in the education sector. And how can the education sector be responding to it? What are we at Climate Mental Health Network doing already in the education sector? And that will be with some organizations we work with, National Environmental Education Foundation and CIRUS. And then the other Instagram Live will be on Thursday, and that will be...
Sarah, I think you cut out again.
Sorry. On Thursday, another Instagram Live with Leslie Davenport, Rachel Moskowitz, and that's for parents, talking about parents and caregivers and their roles and what they can be doing. And then on Wednesday night, we are having an event for Gen Zers, and McKenna will be speaking at that as well, and that will be at on Zoom, and all the information is available on our Instagram page. And just thank you so much, McKenna and Olivia, for doing this today and for being here. And McKenna, thank you for all of your work on this. It's really, really incredible. So, and thanks so much to everyone for joining us live or watching afterwards. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you both.
Thanks.